Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And speaking of books, I have two of my own books coming out this spring and summer. Princess Charming is a picture book, which debuts on April 19th, and Bookends, a memoir of love, loss, and literature, comes out on July 1st, and it is truly a labor of love. I hope you'll pre-order, order, and join me on tour as I go across the country. You can find out more at zibbyowens.com or bookendsmemoir.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at zibbyowens because I always post about everything. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, I need your help. If you love this podcast, you will love my children's book. It's called Princess Charming, and I am really trying to drum up pre-order sales. You might not know this, but before a book comes out is actually a really important time for the whole book's trajectory. So please pre-order Princess Charming, which comes out April 19th today. Just stop what you're doing and go do that, please. When it arrives on April 19th, you can give it to a loved one in your life, a niece, a grandchild, a child, a student, a kid walking by on the street, anybody. But if you could do this, here is my offer. If you email me your receipt showing me that you bought the book online somewhere and pre-ordered it, email info@zibbyowens.com. That's info@zibbyowens.com. And I will pick 10 people to do a special giveaway project award to from my new Bonfire merch store, which you should also check out, which is the Zibby Owens Media Bonfire store, where you can get all sorts of cool t-shirts and tote bags and author sayings and all sorts of great stuff. So what did I say? 10 of you are going to get a special care package of your choice from the Bonfire store, and I will pick at random from all of you who pre-order the book. So if that wasn't clear, go pre-order Princess Charming. Again, it's called Princess Charming. It's my debut picture book. It's really cute and great, and it's illustrated by Holly Haddam. And then after you get the receipt, screenshot it or forward it to me at info@zibbyowens.com, and you will be entered to win one of 10 exciting care packages. So go off and order. Thank you so much. Bye. Jane Green is the author of Sister Stardust, a novel. Jane is the author of 18 New York Times bestsellers and 19 USA Today bestsellers. She's a former journalist in the UK and a graduate of the International Culinary Center in New York. Her many novels include Jemima J., The Beach House, Falling, The Sunshine Sisters, and most recently, The Friends We Keep. She's also published a cookbook called Good Taste. Welcome, Jane. Thank you so much for coming back on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to talk about Sister Stardust.
It's lovely to be here, Zibby. Always great to be on your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Jane, tell listeners what your latest book is about, please.
So Sister Stardust is my first biographical fiction. It was, when I was young, I saw a photograph of an incredibly beautiful woman on a rooftop in Marrakesh. It was taken in actually 1970 in this embroidered, actually, you know what? Here, I have the photograph. I saw this.
Wow.
So this photograph has it struck me, and I just found something that it had a magical, ethereal quality. And I found out that her name was Talitha Getty, that she died very young and very tragically. And I've spent my whole adult life wanting to know more about her. And when my editor said, "Have you ever thought of historical fiction?" I immediately thought, I don't know what her story is, but I want to find out and I want to tell it. And so, obviously it's biographical fiction. So I created a protagonist, Claire, who lives in England in the 60s. And England in the 60s, we were still recovering from the Second World War. London was grey. It was covered in bomb sites, where all the kids would play. My parents would, play with their friends on bomb sites. And all of a sudden in the 60s, Britain won the World Cup and the pill was introduced and, all these things started to happen. Timothy Leary was doing research into psychedelic drugs at Harvard, and suddenly London burst into colour with its own music. We had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. So Claire is desperate to get to London. And once she does, she gets a job as a shop girl, and she falls in with a rock band who are sort of loosely based, inspired by the Rolling Stones. And they spirit her off to Marrakesh to stay with Paul and Talitha Getty. And Paul Getty Jr. was the son of the richest man in the world. From the outside, they looked like they had everything. I mean, they bought this dilapidated palace in Marrakesh and had an American designer friend, Bill Willis, completely renovate it. And it was spectacular. And they threw these wild, orgiastic parties, hundreds of people under the stars, and picnics in the Atlas Mountains where all the houseboys would carry like onion tarts and tagines on brass trays into the mountains. But of course, behind closed doors, it was getting very dark and there were jealousies. Free love was complicated and living that lifestyle was complicated. And also they were diving into, first of all, opium addiction and then heroin addiction. And so Claire, this young innocent girl, she thinks she stepped into the Arabian Nights. And after a while, she has to get pulled in and she doesn't realize the danger that awaits. And it's a coming of age story that's set in the 60s. And yeah, my first biographical / historical fiction.
Wow. So when you had the idea, you knew who you wanted to write about, where did you go? How did you start researching her? And what did you find that you got really excited about early on?
Yeah. What was so interesting about her is that there's almost nothing written about her. There's so little. And I rather suspect that, the Getty family are enormously private and insular. And there were some mysterious circumstances around her death. I think Paul Getty, her husband, felt culpable in some way. And the story changed a couple of times about how exactly and when. So there was so little written about her. So I had to find anybody who was in that circle. And I read everything I could. So it didn't matter how kind of extraneous they were or how much on the outskirts. I read it. And every now and then I'd stumble upon a nugget about Talitha, or, and sometimes the nuggets were quite big. And it was like finding, the diamonds in the haystack. It was just amazing. And it took me about 9 months of just constant reading. And by the end, I felt like I had a very good sense of who she was and why the things that happened to her happened. And the thing I think that I hadn't known was the trauma of her early life, because her father was a painter and they had gone to the Dutch East Indies, to Java, as it was then, on a painting expedition, and the Japanese invaded while they were there. And they rounded up all of the Dutch and threw them into prison camps. And there was a lot of inhumane treatment and torture. And Talitha, would one of her friends, spoke of how he once sort of made a joke gesture at her face with his fingers, and she shrunk back in fear, and actually talked about how when she was a child, the guards in the prison camp would poke their fingers into the children's eyes. And I think her mother then died shortly after. So I think she was deeply damaged, despite being extraordinarily beautiful and having everything that you are supposed to want. And she wasn't just beautiful, she was vivacious. She was just fun-loving, free-spirited, and everybody fell madly in love with her. And it wasn't enough to save her from herself.
Oh, that is a powerful story. I mean, the effects of trauma early on, you wonder, what would she have been like? What would her life have been like had that not been her start?
Well, and also, had she been alive today? Because, of course, now we have access to so much. I mean, therapy and programs and retreats and treatment and medications. And I think in the 60s, particularly in England, because she was raised, her father went to England. So she was raised, first of all, in Holland, but then in England. And it was a very different generation. And also our sensibilities were then, you're very stoic, that you stiff upper lip. And there's a reason why the British colonized the world. It was because the soldiers, the boys were sent off to boarding school at 6, and there was very little love and nurturing. Now, I do think Talitha had that from her stepmother. I think they had a very good relationship, and her father. But I wonder whether so much of the people who did dive into addiction in the 60s were self-medicating. You know, they were running from their pain and drowning it in alcohol or drugs. And I wonder whether so many of those extraordinary talents that we lost so early, you know, Jim Morrison, I mean, the list goes on, but the 27 Club, Mark Bolan, whether things would have been different, you know, had they had access to some of the things we now have access to today.
Who do you think Talitha would be today? Like, who is she most comparable to in the celebrity world these days? Even at her peak before the damage, is there anybody that kind of resonates in that way?
I think Kate Moss, actually. I think Kate Moss is, I always think, because the other sort of huge inspiration for the book, although I didn't realize it when I started writing about it, I didn't realize how much the Rolling Stones were linked to Morocco in the 60s. And Morocco was really an enormous retreat from them. Whenever things sort of blew up in London and whenever drugs were found or there was a drugs bust, the Rolling Stones would head out to Morocco. And there was a love triangle. Brian Jones was the founder of the Rolling Stones, and he was this extraordinarily gifted musician. He put the band together. He found Keith and Mick. He named the Rolling Stones. And they always used to say about him, he could pick up any instrument, and even if he'd never played it before, he would create something magical immediately. He was also enormously damaged. His girlfriend was a woman called Anita Pallenberg. Forgive me for being stuffed up. I'm getting over a cold, not COVID, happily. But his girlfriend was this woman, Anita Pallenberg, who was terrifying and brilliant and beautiful. And she was very much the muse for the Rolling Stones. And actually, she and Brian had a very troubled relationship. There was a lot of, he would beat her up. It was really problematic. And they, after one of the drugs bust, it's a famous one called the Redlands bust, which happened at Keith Richards' home in England. Keith, Brian and Anita jumped into the back of his Bentley S3 Continental, went to Tangier. Brian got pneumonia on the way. They dropped him off. And of course, Keith and Anita then fell madly in love in the back of the car. And that inspired the story, a lot of the story in Sister Stardust. But Anita Pallenberg was great friends with Kate Moss, even as an older woman. And I think that Kate Moss has that kind of, I don't know, almost a magical quality. She's a hard partier. And, friends of mine have worked with her on shoots, and they always said it didn't matter how hard she partied. Once the camera was on, she was just magic. And I think she is probably the one today that I think is most like the women of that era.
Interesting. I love it. You have a whole nother piece of this book, which is Claire and Claire's story and the loss of her mother and her father and her stepmother, and also her relationship to her own body and how she tries to come to terms with that. And it's almost the impetus for her leaving home is sort of sneaking food and all of that. And you have some really interesting lines about her relationship with food. So I was going to just read, if that's okay, just like a couple of quick lines. This is towards the beginning, but it's about Claire and her body. She said, "I tried to fight it. I tried to bury myself in a book, but the words swam on the page. I could taste the chocolate, feel the chocolate, and I couldn't think about anything else. I raced downstairs, grabbed the 10X, and took them up to my bedroom, guilt, fear, and excitement making my heart pound." And then you say, "For those few minutes of eating, I felt absolutely nothing. I didn't understand then that I was using food as a drug, numbing myself from pain, that no amount of numbness would stave off the crushing guilt and shame that would sweep over me the minute I finished eating, the minute that chocolate was all gone. I knew I had to finish them." And then later, you say, "Oh, what misery, I think now, looking back at young me. I was perfect just as I was. Why did we think that being thin was the answer to everything? How did we buy into such a ridiculous thing?" Okay, so tell me about this piece of the story.
Well, I've written about, I suppose, I can't say it's all women's relationship with food, and I am enormously gratified to see my daughter and her friends having a very, very different relationship to their bodies and to their food. So a lot of it is about timing, is about growing up in I was born in 1968. It was about growing up in the 70s and also growing up in a family where beauty and thinness was celebrated. There wasn't really an option. And I was clearly neither of those things. And so I grew up feeling like I was just a disappointment and inadequate in every way. And so that has fueled a lot of my books. I mean, from my first book that was published in the States, Jemima J, to I didn't think I'd be writing about it again now, but I realized the culture of that time was extreme skinniness. Twiggy was who everybody aspired to be, and she had the figure of a boy. And so the pressure on women was enormous. So I decided that Claire would be somebody who had to go through some of that journey. And actually, look, she does it in that time. You needed to be a certain way to have an odd, or I don't know that you needed to be, because there were people who didn't, but it made life easier then. And I'm so happy that it's not that way anymore. I'm so relieved for my children and the younger generation. But I certainly felt it, and I wanted to put that in the book because that was all sort of part of her journey. And the truth is, it doesn't really make much of a difference, as though, my weight has fluctuated my entire life. Sometimes I'm bigger, sometimes I'm smaller. Do I feel different when I'm thinner? Well, I get to wear whatever I want. I love kind of being able to wear smaller, tighter clothes, but I'm also turning 54 this year, and I'm really happy in a caftan or a poncho. It's also menopause. I mean, I wish I was that. And I probably have to start doing some exercise now because I'm really, really bad at it. But, menopause sort of turns your whole life upside down. And I think that I'm too busy to fight it by doing 3 hours of exercise a day. It's just, that's never going to happen. I do walk. I could probably walk more. But it's the things that have made me stop and think, and there are so many situations that have come up again and again in my life, and they always find their way into my books.
Interesting. I mean, I'm glad to hear that about your daughters. I don't feel like it's totally gone, though. I mean, I do feel that, at least from my vantage point, or maybe not just my kids, but social media and all that. I mean, I do feel there's a lot of pressure still. And with COVID, there's been a rise in eating disorders in young girls with Instagram and all of that. So I hope that what you're saying is the case as we move forward, but I'm not sure it's completely gone.
So I don't know that I agree with that. I also think there's a socioeconomic factor in that when you live in a big city like New York or like LA, you have these girls who have a tremendous amount of pressure, and I think a lot of it is actually for them the pressure of living up to their parents' standards, of going to schools that are intensely competitive, of the fear that they are not good enough. And so, again, I mean, I was eating disordered because of that reason. And so I think in towns that have that kind of pressure, absolutely, the girls are still very much under it. And I know, I mean, I can count, I mean, I know a number of families right now whose daughters are struggling really hard with eating disorders. And I live in Westport, Connecticut. I mean, of course that's going to happen. You go to somewhere like Austin, Texas, where my daughter is at university, that's not the case. And actually, all sizes are celebrated. And I am seeing that more and more on Instagram with younger people, not perhaps in the cities. I think the pressure is still very much on.
So it's time for me to take a trip to Austin, Texas.
Yeah. All of us. I once did a keynote. It was somewhere in the Midwest. I don't even remember where it was, but it was like somewhere like Ohio, and I wasn't feeling very good about myself. I was definitely on the bigger side, and afterwards, there were a lot of men. It was a tech thing, and there were a lot of men in the audience. And afterwards, the organizer was like, "Oh, they were all saying, how pretty you are," and I was like, "Oh my God!" I felt so good. I was like, "I want to move here," because I was feeling so awful about myself, and I was getting this validation. But that's also food for thought, that it's cultural as well.
That's true. I know we think that where we are, sometimes these are the only people, these are the only views, but there's a whole world out there. And so for any people who need the consolation of that. It's very true. So Jane, after all of this time you spent into Talitha's life and this crazy time in history and all of that, what has changed now about your view of the world and like how you're going about your life, and like how is this research and this writing and this process, how, if at all, has it changed you?
Well, I think I started this journey actually when I turned 50. And in fact, my birthday party was a 70s Moroccan or 60s Moroccan birthday party. And it was, I think as I turned 50, I just thought, who the hell am I? I've spent 50 years of my life trying to fit in, not feeling good enough. And I'm really, really fed up with this. And I've got to figure out who the hell I am, because I don't want to step into, what Jung called the afternoon of life, not knowing. I don't want to live like this anymore. And Talitha was, in fact, when I look back on my ideas for what I would wear, because it was costume, for my 50th, it's all pictures of Talitha. It's Talitha, Verushka, and Marissa Berenson, like all over my photo feed. So I think it started then. And I think sort of diving into her world, I think I have a freedom that I didn't have before. I think I was so frightened that people would see that I wasn't good enough, that I was always quite stiff and was very rarely able to relax. And I think that I am much more relaxed. I definitely drink much more. I definitely do drugs more than I used to, sometimes a little bit too much. So the influence is, I'm very aware of the bad things that can happen. And the problem is I'm a lightweight, actually. That's the real problem. The problem is it's not even that I do too much, it's that I can't handle it. And so, what for everybody else is totally fine, for me just wipes me out. The number of times it's like, oh, I have a migraine, you have to take me home. But I think there is a freedom. I'm having fun. I'm having more fun in my 50s than I have ever had before in my life. And it's also, I think I'm very aware now that I'm not somebody who fits in, and that's fine. In fact, I love it. I wouldn't want to be somebody who fits in. It started with the pink hair, and I think that was my kind of experimentation of trying to figure out who I am. And now I realize, I am whoever I feel like on that day. But it's sifted out the wrong people. And also, I think being authentically me has attracted the right people. So I'm in a really good place.
That's amazing. I love that. It's inspiring and awesome. And there's so much, I feel like there's so much fear about getting older and this and that. And there's not enough like, hey, you know what? It gets better. It gets amazing. I mean,
it really does. I mean, because you stop. I mean, I still care a little bit. Somebody wrote to me today that there's, drama, an author who has sort of bullied me fairly regularly on social media channels. And I went and found what had been posted and watched it. And 5 years ago, I would have been devastated. I mean, every time this has happened in the past, I have been devastated. And I watched it today and I just thought, gosh, this happened 15 years ago. And this is, I'm sad that this is something that you're carrying, that you've been carrying for 15 years. And the fact that it didn't floor me, it didn't have me, spend the day in tears or try and, think about doing something in revenge, or kind of hit back. It's just like, it's, you go and live your life, and I'm living mine, and actually I'm good.
I can't believe someone is bullying you on social media. I can't even begin to wonder what they're even saying that could possibly be the negative in this. Now I have to go scroll and try to figure it out.
Well, and this is the thing. I realize when you carry things like that about anybody, it's never about them. It's never about them. And I'm having a hot flash. Look, you can see I'm going scarlet.
I actually did notice that. I was like, is she getting really upset about this? We can talk about something else.
No, I'm actually having a hot flash. You know what I've done? I've done a lot of work. I've been in 12-step programs for 20 years. Clearly not, alcohol is not one of them. Perhaps it should be. But I've been in 12-step programs for 20 years. Al-Anon has changed my life. And I've done the work. And what I know is that other people's behavior is none of my business, nothing to do with me. So, yeah, so it's really love. And I feel that about just life in general, whereas I used to get so upset. And I'm inherently a pleaser. I want to be liked. I want everybody to like me. And it used to be so hard when people didn't. And now it's okay.
Well, I really like you. For whatever that's worth. Oh.
Well, Zibby, let me say something else as well. I think that because I felt so insecure, I think I also projected a very different image of who I actually am. And I think, I stepped into the role of who I thought I was supposed to be as a best-selling author. And I think also, I'm English and I speak, received pronunciation, and I think that can be intimidating. And I think people often assume that I'm quite grand, or they project things onto me that actually aren't me at all. And the thing is, today this really is me, but 15 years ago I do understand how I came across. And I also know from my own journey, I have given talks and walked into rooms of very beautiful Park Avenue apartments that have been filled with women that have looked me up and down and I thought dismissed me. And then I have talked and I have then had those same women line up to hug me and burst into tears in my arms. And I realized that I've made exactly the same judgments about them. And it was nothing to do with them. They were just being them. It was me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you thought about writing a book about this type of thing? Like that's not fiction, that's about this, like, because that would be really powerful, I think.
Yes. This is something that my agent has been wanting me to do. It's sort of, I'm not quite sure what it would be, and he said, don't even worry about what it should be. I mean, whether it's kind of memoir or because I'm so nervous about memoir because nervous about writing about my family and my growing up. I've done it a little bit. And, my first book actually, where I did write a little bit about my childhood and, my mother stopped talking to me for a while and then eventually sort of phoned up and apologized for my childhood. But, and I also recognized my parents did the best they could with the tools they had, which were none. Nobody had tools in those days. So, but I'm nervous about it, but he said, just stream of consciousness. And I do realize that every time I post something on Instagram or Facebook about this and about, the word authenticity, it's like, it's hard for me because it's just become so ubiquitous now. But I think just we're living in a society that is so judgmental, and particularly on Instagram, we make so many assumptions, and I'm guilty of it. When in my old house, whenever I posted pictures of my beautiful kitchen, I'd slide the 3 ceiling-high piles of crap, 6 feet off to the side, so the kitchen looked amazing. We all portray our lives as beautiful, and we don't show the messy and the difficult and the hard. Now, sometimes we can't because we're just trying to get through the day and we're just trying to get through it until we can talk about it. But I think there is something in this, and I think I think I'm getting ready to start writing about it. Maybe.
Well, if you want to open invitation to publish this with Zibby Books, if you want to do this memoir with us, I mean, honestly, this is exactly the type of story, and I'm sure people would be clamoring for your memoir, but this is what we want, showing the mess, showing the real, because all this hiding, it doesn't help anybody, right? It doesn't help people get through. The clean kitchens are not making anybody feel good.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something to aspiration, like, oh, I would love... your house, I completely fell in love with, as you know, on Instagram, that I was like, I'm going to drive up and just buy this house. I'm kidding.
So I think the key is, because you're right, I love looking at pictures of gorgeous homes. I was staying at my brother's. You've met my brother, Charlie. I was staying at Charlie's a couple of weeks ago. And 3 weeks prior, he'd said to me, oh, Jane, I'm showing the house. He's selling his house. I'm showing the house. So just let you know. I went, oh, yeah, I'm really good at showing houses. And then, of course, it went out of my head. And so I'm lying in bed in my pajamas, messing around on my computer. Doorbell rings. some couple is there to see the house, and then an estate agent is there, and he went, oh, sorry, we're a bit early. I went, well, give me 10 minutes. And so the kids' toys were all over, so I shoved them under pillows, but I hadn't gone upstairs. So the two sets of people came in to see the house. And it wasn't until they'd gone that I realized there was dog poo all over the garden. The beds were unmade. There were clothes all over the floor in the kids' rooms. And now I was like, Charlie, you can't show a house like this. I was getting a list of everything he needed to do. And there is something for me about seeing, I want to buy into the aspirational lifestyle, but I also want the realness, and I'm happy to have it side by side. So I think I'm still posting pictures of my house, my teeny tiny little cottage looking gorgeous, and I'm talking about very real things. And sometimes often in stories you'll see me with no makeup on, looking pretty frightening.
Well, you have an amazing Instagram. It's like completely entertaining, and you never know what you're going to get. I love it. It's true entertainment channels. It's amazing. What's your next book that's scheduled to come out?
I don't know, actually. I don't know. I have written a sequel to Sister Stardust, which takes two of the characters and takes them forward 10 years to 1979. Well, slightly less than 10 years, 1979. But that is actually exclusively for a podcast, for a new podcast company that I'm actually involved with called Gemini 13.
Ooh.
And that will be coming out. It's a novella, and it will be exclusively available on podcast. I don't quite know what I'm going to do with the publishing of that. Yeah, we'll see. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the next one will be.
So maybe this memoir. There you go.
Yeah, maybe.
Amazing. Jane, thank you. It's always so great to talk to you and just to be so real, and you're just telling it like it is. I mean, it's the best thing that can happen. So I love it. I really love it. It's refreshing and open and honest and you and awesome. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always just so lovely seeing you. Thank you, Zibby.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, take care. Okay, bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.